Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Romina Bandura. I'm a senior fellow here at the Project on Prosperity and Development. It is a pleasure to be moderating this discussion. This discussion in this room, it's about the energy transition and its implications for the workforce in terms of jobs, job creation, job loss, training, and policies that we can enact to make that adjustment smoother. The next, so if you're not here for workforce, there's another breakout panel on Africa. Just wanted to clarify that. So before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I just wanted to frame a little bit the topic. The global workforce is undergoing many changes and challenges. We have technological disruptions, population growth in fragile states, high informality, and low quality jobs. The transition to a low carbon economy will also impact the global workforce as countries and industries shift towards cleaner and more sustainable practices. There will be winners and losers. The commitment to move away from fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gases by 2050 will affect some countries and industry more than others. In developing countries, think about what will happen to Nigeria or South Africa versus Argentina or Bolivia, who have, Argentina has a lot of mineral resources. And so these changes will affect the workforce. According to the International Energy Agency, 30 million clean energy jobs will have to be created to achieve net zero by 2050. So that's in 26 years, yep. But 60% of these will require some training. Similarly, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, the report Skills for a Greener Future, predicts net job creation from the transition, but provided that there are massive investments in retraining and other policy measures. So workers will need to undergo retraining, acquire new skills, but my question also, part of the discussion that we're going to have is, if you're 50 and you lose your job in a declining industry such as coal, it may be a little bit challenging to, retrain and tell you, to move also, because, the new jobs might not be in your same geography. So, but alarmingly, countries are not ready for this transition. Many Paris Agreement signatories recognize the importance of skills development, but only 40% have an implementation plan. So, which reminds me of what happened a little bit to the decline of the coal and manufacturing industries here in the United States, or the steel industry in the UK, where there were not a lot of programs to retrain workers or help them weather the adjustment. I remember, if you're 40 and above, you might remember this film in the 1990s called The Full Monty, which tells the story of a group of steel workers from Sheffield that lose their jobs and what they resort to make a living. And so I know it's a movie, but for me, that movie resonates with this topic. So to unpack some of these issues, and you might disagree or agree with me, but on these topics, but we have a really excellent panel here. We're going to unpack these issues in an hour and 15 minutes, I believe, so we can solve this very fast. So I'll introduce briefly our panelists and ask them to talk a little bit about their work and how they see these shifts. So to my left, we have Dr. Elizabeth Rupert-Bulmer. She's lead economist in the jobs group at the World Bank. Next to her is Mariana Alfonso. She's sector lead specialist on climate change and sustainability at the Inter-American Development Bank. Then we have Dr. Lisbeth Stier. She's president and CEO of Education Development Center. Andrew Wills is Senior Vice President of Federal Affairs at Invenergy. And then Mel Coppolo is Vice President of Sustainability at Albright Stonebridge Group. Welcome, and I'll start from my left and we'll move. But can you tell us a little bit, Elizabeth, how you're approaching this topic? You've done a lot of research, so how do you see the transition and its implications for the workforce?
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here, and thanks for the invitation to join, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists as well on this very challenging topic. A lot of our work was backward looking to see if there were what kinds of lessons, and a lot of the lessons are do not do this, right? Or do not repeat. Yeah. And because it's not just the coal sector, and a lot of my work is on coal sector, but it applies to any sort of large technological change that's coming, we hope, with the green transition. And some of those, we know from those experiences that the spillovers go beyond the directly affected workers, and they touch lots of different sectors as well. So the World Bank has developed this sort of multi-sectoral approach, sort of our modus operandi anyway, and it has 3 pillars. One is focusing on the governance issues, people and community, and the third is land remediation and repurposing. And so in the governance, it really is focusing on the fact that the institutions responsible for maybe the coal region, there are many institutions, and then how do you align the different ministerial programs with a global, sort of a national strategy of green transition? People and communities, self-explanatory. We focus, the initial focus is very much on the workers directly affected, but you have workers in the coal value chain, for example, and then you have the people in the communities who are either working or not working, but you have what the research has shown, and we can see this even just anecdotally, is the local effects. There are a lot of spatial implications to the local effects. And then from my perspective in particular, as a labor economist, I'm looking at the labor market dynamics, how the local labor markets relate to the national level labor markets, and the supply behavior, if you will, of a displaced worker. So are they willing to retrain? I think you can retrain a 50-year-old. I'm a senior of 50, so I'm still active. But am I willing to be retrained? And that's really a bit of the tension that we're seeing, and a misalignment of the expectations, including wage expectations of displaced workers and the available demand in the local labor market. I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. Mariana, you work a lot in Latin America, so can you give us a little bit of your regional view?
So I think, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Romina, for inviting me, and thank you for the other panelists to join here today. So basically, one of the things that we need to recognize in Latin America sometimes is slightly different from other regions in the world. For example, our highest emitting sector is not energy, is not transport, it's agriculture, land use, and forestry. That sector, AFOLU, accounts for 46% of emissions in the region. And that's a sector that we need to, is differently from fossil fuel industry, that will have to probably eventually disappear. That's a sector that needs to be transformed. And that's one of the things that we need to understand about the region. The other thing that we need to understand about the region is that this transition to net zero and all the economic shifts that are going to happen are happening in a context of extreme inequality and very high labor informality. So we need to acknowledge the context. When in some countries, 80% of the workforce is in the informal sector, and you need to take that into account. Also, taxation and public spending is highly regressive. That's another issue that characterizes the region. So when we're thinking about the transition to net zero, we have that context. So we have to, in a sense, and we know in the past, especially from the trade liberalization efforts in the 80s and 90s, that you need to anticipate who are going to be winning and who is going to be losing from this. So we recently did a paper on trying to understand the potential impact that the transition to net zero is going to have in the region, and we kind of identified 5 key areas. One has to do with the employment and skills, which is the topic that we're discussing today. We had done a study with ILO a couple of years ago where we estimated that about 15 million net jobs could be created in the region due to the transition, but they're going to be, that's net. There are going to be jobs that are going to be created, and there are going to be jobs that are going to be lost. And also the jobs that are going to be created are not necessarily in the same type of, require the same type of skills. They're not equally distributed between men and women, and they're not necessarily in the same geographical regions where the jobs are going to be destroyed. So we have to anticipate those labor market effects. Second place, we know that the transition will have important distribution impacts. Households in Latin America and the Caribbean, differently from other regions in the world, spend a higher share of their household spending on food and energy. So, for example, in Argentina, 53% of household spending is in energy and food. If you are taking away fossil fuel subsidies, prices of the basic goods basket might increase. And that also could affect poverty. So again, we need to take into account this distributional effect. As Elizabeth was saying, like the transition could be very localized. Some communities are the entire economy of a community is could be tied to a fossil fuel industry. So basically, if you're decommissioning a coal plant or a fossil fuel plant, then that community is not only going to lose direct employment, but also indirect employment and induced employment. The entire value chain of that community could be disrupted. So you need to think about what other economic opportunities and business promotion opportunities you can have to make sure that that community does not become like kind of a ghost town, as you were mentioning with the workers in the full Monty. And fiscal impact. A lot of fossil fuel resources like gas and petroleum royalties are used to finance social investments. In Colombia, close to 6% of their education budget comes from gas royalties and petroleum royalties. So again, what's going to happen if you reduce that sector? What's going to happen with social spending? What's going to happen with social investments? And lastly, we need to take into account the political economy. Embarking into decarbonization efforts can often face backlash if they're not communicated clearly, if you don't anticipate the negative and mitigate for the negative effects, and if you don't involve the relevant stakeholders in a productive dialogue and discussion. So those are kind of the areas in which we identify we need to work in the next couple of years to ensure that the transition is just and inclusive for everyone in the region.
Thank you. Lisbeth, you work for a training institution. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and how do you see this transition happening?
Thank you. Well, first of all, for some years now, we've been trying to make the case in the education sector for greater investment. And the reason for that is that when you look at the state of education around the world, it is in a really bad place. And most people don't actually know that in sub-Saharan Africa, only 10% of young people have basic numeracy and literacy skills. In northern Middle East and North Africa, that goes up to 25%. So for us in the education sector, we've long wondered, why is it that this issue isn't getting more attention, and why is there not more public investment in this sector? And then when you go to the climate community and you turn up at the climate conferences, you see a lot of discussions around the need for more finance to get climate in the right place, the need for new technologies, but often the people aspect is missed. And you mentioned this, Romina, that the NDCs do not really account for workforce and skills training. And what we also observe is that in most of the modeling around the climate transitions, whether it's the energy transition or other transitions, we don't see this human capital piece factored in consistently, which means that actually we probably have totally underestimated the cost of the transition because we haven't yet really fully calculated what would it cost to upskill. And we've also likely misestimated the speed of the transition because there is this assumption that the workforce will be available and that we will be able, it's just about the political will to move from this sector to that sector. But if you don't have the people, you are not going to make that transition. On the flip side, I think what we don't yet have is a narrative of opportunity because in a way, the whole transition, the green transition, is actually a massive opportunity to get it right and to get it right for those who are left behind. Because if you indeed take the opportunity to upskill and reskill the labor force, including the young people, because 70% of the African population, and CSIS has done some amazing work on the demographics, is young, this could be a huge double whammy, so to speak. You can solve the human development problem and you can solve the climate problem at the same time. Back in last year when we had the Africa Climate Summit, President Ruto of Kenya really tried to project this narrative of hope for the continent. Africa is not the victim, it is the victim, but it doesn't want to be portrayed as the victim of climate change. It wants to be part of the solution. And I think this really needs to become much sort of more core to the narrative. At EDC, we've done some work, and my colleague Melanie Sani is here on kind of trying to understand what are the sort of issues that stand in the way of making progress on this, and we identified 5 of them. The first one has to do with simply understanding the situation, and you talked about sort of the need for local labor market assessments of demand for skills and the opportunities that are out there in terms of the green economy. The second is to do with coordination, because we do have a situation where we need to bring together governments, the private sector, training institutions, civil society organizations, chambers of commerce, that whole system, ecosystem that needs to be created at the local level, at the local as well as the national and the global level. There is then obviously the issue of training institutions. The current state of education systems is totally mismatched with the needs out there. We need to invest in a big way and invest in an innovative way. I was earlier this week there's a big conference here that the US Aid has been organizing around education. A lot of talk about, let's no longer talk about degrees, but about skills and certifications, so that we think in a whole new way about how we train and upskill people. The fourth area is finance, and that's finance for sort of, obviously we talk about the climate transition, but the finance for this whole reskilling piece, which is in dire states as well. We need to solve for that. And we also need to provide the finance for the entrepreneurs who want to get businesses going in the green economy. And then the final piece is inclusion, is around how are we going to target our efforts towards those who are left furthest behind, so that as this transition happens, we really harness that opportunity to get it right and to make the transition just.
Thank you. Andrew, you come from the private sector. Tell us a little bit about Invenergy and how you are looking at this, transition.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to do that, because I always think Invenergy is the biggest company that nobody knows about. We're the world's largest, well, at least the country's largest, and we think the world's largest private clean energy developer, owner, and operator. We're building solar, wind, storage, hydrogen, offshore wind, desal, gas, transmission, and pretty much everything in between. We've developed more than 30 gigawatts of clean power that's being pumped into grids all over the country and all over the world. We've got a hydrogen hub in the Midwest that we're working with Constellation on, and we're the only American company to own 2 offshore wind leases in the United States, one in New Jersey and one off of the coast of Morro Bay in California. So for 20 years, our story has been much like the industry story, one of transition. Since we began operating our first facility in 2003 in Tennessee, which is the first project that we'll decommission as a company this year, we have expanded to 4 continents, and we have more than 2,500 people employed directly by Invenergy around the world. In 2022 alone, we supported directly 4,000 construction jobs, and since that date, for a couple obvious reasons, that number is growing exponentially, double, triple, quadruple. Just think IRA and IIJA and what it's done for the industry. We're active in 40 states and a dozen countries, so we really have a unique perspective on how jobs are being created and where and how we can take advantage of that. And I think I also want to highlight, and we can talk more about this in our discussion, but jobs that are created around just working for the wind facility, or just working for the solar facility, or just working for the offshore wind facility. There are so many opportunities that we open the door for through these projects. Think things like local employees at city governments. We're investing $10, $20, $30 million into the government itself through taxes. New jobs that are created there. So I want to put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to talk about 2 just general issues, projects, things that Invenergy is really involved in, and kind of the impacts that it's having on the industry writ large. One is manufacturing. With domestic content requirements in the IRA and IIJA, we're seeing these at the federal level, at the state level, even at the local level to some extent, and that's sparking a huge demand for products produced here in America, and that's a great thing, of course. We're going to have another industrial revolution because of it. From inverters to solar trackers, solar racks, modules, wind turbines to wind towers, conduit to transmission towers, hydrogen electrolyzers to transmission converter stations, steel, aluminum, glass, polysilicon. All of these products are things that we need as an industry to continue to do our jobs, and we need to buy it here because we want the added tax incentives that come with that. This growing workforce that's being created because of these incentives is not too dissimilar from other manufacturing jobs and workforces that already exist in America because of the Industrial Revolution. Technologies, of course, are a little different than they looked in the 18th century, but the skills, the living wages, the certainty and ingenuity there is pretty much the same. Invenergy recently opened a manufacturing facility of solar modules in Pataskala, Ohio. It will be, when it gets to the end of the year, the largest U.S. Solar module manufacturing company, and it employs more than 1,000 Ohioans and will produce 5 gigawatts of solar panels by the end of the year. So that's just a really good example of how so many jobs are being created as a sort of tangential result of the transition. And finally, offshore wind. I know we probably have all heard stories here in America and even internationally on the offshore wind industry. It is a challenge, I'm not going to lie, but it does provide so many opportunities to make investments in communities. For example, the state of New Jersey, where we are selling our power for our leading light wind facility off the coast of New Jersey. Because of that, as a result of that, New Jersey required, of course, investments in the state to be a part of the project. Invenergy went above and beyond. The way we got that opportunity is by promising more to the states. And that promise really is millions of dollars directly into the workforce, directly into creating this new thing that absolutely and literally does not exist in America right now. So we can dive into offshore wind a little bit more, but there's a lot there to cover. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew. And finally, Mel, you also work a lot with companies, so we wanted to hear your perspective on this, just your opening remarks and what you do.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's been very interesting to listen to my other panelists, and as the last person, it's my job to be provocative, so we'll see if I can meet that goal. It is clearly undeniable, right, that a transition to green industries and energy sources is required. I don't think there's anyone who would deny that. But managing the workforce transition in the context of reducing CO2 emissions requires a multifaceted approach that involves, in my opinion, collaboration between government, private sector, and civil society. When discussing the energy transition, we must be mindful that reality is far more complex than good versus bad, or clean versus polluting actors, and there are many other stakeholders involved, notably consumers. The fact that The fact is that all industry sectors will need to transition to cleaner and more efficient operations and energy sources. However, quite a few businesses, especially those business models that still rely on extractive industries, are seen as an obstacle for decarbonization goals. Yet many of these companies are among the top investors in research and innovation efforts needed to facilitate a transition towards less emissions-intense energy sources. It is literally a matter of business survival for them if they don't. But for businesses to deploy resources for research, development, implementation of new technologies, sound policies are required, especially in skilling and reskilling of workers. Additionally, fiscal incentives that promote inclusivity and competitiveness will further facilitate this, especially for SMEs. Governments and businesses must invest in education and training programs tailored to the needs of the green economy, ensuring that workers have access to opportunities for career advancement and job security. Countries need to integrate upskilling and reskilling programs within policies to mitigate and adapt to climate change. This is particularly crucial in developing countries, which has been mentioned, where vulnerable populations are at a risk of being disproportionately affected by job placements. To add some numbers to what Elizabeth mentioned about NDCs, in February 2022, the IOE did its study, and it was determined that less than 40% of NDCs include any plans for skills training to support their implementation, and over 20% do not have any plan for human capital-related activities at all. But the scale of transformation required to meet Paris commitments cannot be met without business working with governments to find ways to respond to growing populations that seek reliable, affordable energy sources to run things like businesses, schools, and hospitals. A better coordination across macroeconomic, sustainable investment, industrial, sectoral, social, and enterprise policies is required. Holistic policies would enable businesses to develop, implement greener and resource-efficient production practices to align the supply of skills with growing demand and to facilitate smooth and efficient reallocation of workers to newly created green jobs. In addition to focusing on the skills and livelihood of workers, it's crucial to consider the broader implications of industries and countries that have been heavily reliant on carbon-intensive sectors. The transition to cleaner practices will inevitably result in winners and losers, and proactive measures must be taken to support the most affected industries and regions. This could involve targeted investments in alternative economic activities, support for diversification strategies, and measures to promote inclusive growth and development. But I don't think that training alone is enough. We must address the social and economic impacts of workforce transition, requiring comprehensive social assistance measures, including unemployment insurance, relocation incentives, and support for displaced workers to re-enter the labor market. This is essential for mitigating the negative consequences of job loss and ensuring that individuals and communities can adapt to the changing economic landscape. Lastly, I believe we can only achieve a just transition if the accompanying policies that I've mentioned are rooted in the realities faced by businesses, which is why a social dialogue process must be included. It is particularly important to hear the perspectives of both employers and workers when discussing a just transition, given that climate agenda is interlinked with economic and labor policies. I've worked in and around the ILO for many, many years, and their tripartite example is something that we should all take on board. It is governments, it is labor, employers, civil society working together, realizing that policies don't exist in a bubble, and everyone needs to be at the table.
Thank you. So since we mentioned a little bit winners and losers, can each of you tell me a little bit, like, who do you think, from your research, obviously, and from your experience, what occupations are, going to be created, or what are some of the opportunities, and what are some of the occupations that you see are going to be declining, and we'll need to focus on, maybe those people the most. So maybe Elizabeth, I'll start with you.
I'm going to link that to a little bit of a point that was just made in terms of needing the comprehensive approach to policies, but really understanding the local context and the distortions. And that's where having national level training, policies, education, all really important, but getting that to trickle down to serve the affected population is a big challenge, and not just in LDCs, also in middle-income countries as well that might not have the public employment services institutions that are really geared to this. And there's another thing I want to point out, which is there's this middle ground that even good policy context cannot solve, right? So the social protection system is really meant to, and unemployment insurance is very important for the transition, but that's temporary, right? Social protection. You need money, but you can't provide it forever, because that is what killed the local economies in Poland 30 years ago. So social protection is important, but to qualify for that, so for example in Bosnia, the bar is very, very low. So you have to be extremely poor to get any kind of support. So what does that do for the regular Joe Schmo workers who's in, either working in retail or whatever? So the institutions aren't there because it needs to be the private sector that's coming and creating these jobs, and yet how do you do economic diversification? That sounds great, but doing that in a remote, I'll take the coal context, in a remote coal region which doesn't have good links to the larger population centers, doesn't have good road infrastructure, what big private investor is going to want to come there and build some big new factory that's going to create these jobs? So it's a big challenge. So I pointed out challenges rather than solutions.
Okay. So from your research, Mariana, what do you see like, I don't want to say, some countries will lose, some will win, maybe, or it's going to be mixed, but what are some of the occupations that you see are?
Eventually, most occupations will have to be transformed, because as I was saying earlier, you have to green and make greener and sustainable almost every industry. So even though those jobs are not going to disappear, still you need new skills to make sure that those occupations are becoming more sustainable too. We're expected to see big changes in agricultural, energy, forestry, construction, manufacturing. But again, a lot of things are mostly transforming current occupations that destroying existing occupations. One of the problems that the region faces is that, compared, for example, a study that was done in the US, is that based on the tasks and the skills jobs require, we are estimating that only 13% of workers in LAC could be part of the green economy. So they're not going to easily transition into the green economy given the occupations they currently have. So that actually it's a warning sign in terms of what type of skill deployment strategies we can have. And I think I want to go back to the point of planning and financing. When we discuss I'm working on the climate change division with the social sector, and one of the things that always happens to me is that most of the conversations in the climate space are about, again, regulations, technology, and financing, but it always forgets human capital development strategy. And you see over and over again these great ideas of green hydrogen, by 2030, and there's no human development strategy attached to it. So where are you going to get the workforce for that? How much is it going to cost? And the state of training institutions in the region are actually worrisome for that. So I think there's again, we need to have a clear understanding of what are going to be the jobs that are going to be created, what jobs are going to be destroyed, what type of skills the new jobs are going to be created. Do we have the programs and the right training institutions in place? Do we have? Are we working with industry to make sure that we are actually providing training that is relevant and that is useful for the industries that are transforming themselves? Do we have the fiscal resources devoted to that? again, like usually it's not part of any climate plan. Human capital, it's basically like a very like thin line at the end. There's a footnote. There's a mention of just transition, but usually it's not part. It's not part of the comprehensive landscape of where we're going in 2050. So yes, that's.
Elizabeth, you mentioned opportunities in Africa. What are some, maybe, I know you can't predict, but what are some of these occupations that you see emerging, in Africa in the transition?
We actually don't know. I think we can, obviously, there's lots of studies being done about what the trends might be, and there's lists and lists. I mean, there are organizations coming up with 150, 200, 300 new occupations that are out there. I think the piece that we are not discussing here is AI, digitalization, intersect that with the whole energy transition and climate transition. Well, there's a world out there that we actually don't know what's going to lie ahead even 5 years from now. And so even though we can obviously do the necessary work at the local level to try and respond, and we need to make sure that we have the information in the best way possible, but our best bet is to make sure that we have a flexible workforce, that we create skills and competencies that actually help people to move from one job to another. Because the World Economic Forum has been out there saying for some years that all our children are going to have probably 6, 7, 10 jobs. We are going to have to move really fast. And so I think we need the tools to assess and to make sure that we can respond to local labor market needs and do some degree of planning. Obviously, there are countries in Africa that are rich in minerals, with our country in Africa who are really set up very well to get the hydro economy going. So, of course, there are kind of big things that we can identify. But at the base, I think we need to really look for creating a skills base that is flexible and adaptable, and that also gives people the business acumen and the entrepreneurship, because I think someone mentioned earlier, at the moment, Africa has a huge informal economy, and a lot of these jobs need to be created through entrepreneurship. We kind of tend to think about big companies. Invenergy one, and Michael Polsky is an amazing man who actually emphasizes this issue of skills very much. So we think about the big sort of companies, but a lot of this is going to have to come from entrepreneurship, greening of existing small businesses and creating new businesses. And so that is, I think, where we really need to build the skills.
So thank you, Andrew. Talking about, you talk a little bit about the type of occupations at the beginning. So can you tell me a little bit, like, if an oil engineer would like to work at Invenergy, would you be able to retrain, that oil engineer? What type of occupations are you hiring for? What type of skills? So more, practical. Let's get back to the practical.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to your previous question, who's going to be left behind? And, I think for a long time we thought, the rural communities are going to be left behind. The agricultural communities, the fossil communities are going to be left behind. But ironically, as we've sort of implemented IRA, we're seeing just the exact opposite. Those communities are where funding is going. We don't have room to put a 1,000 megawatt solar farm in New York City. We put it in rural areas. So that provides great opportunity. I mean, just an example of a project we have right now is a 16,000 acre solar facility in Texas that we're building. That's a huge, massive facility with thousands of construction jobs that not construction jobs that last a month, but construction jobs that last over the course of 2 years. And we're also putting our manufacturing facility and any other sort of like industrial processes that Invenergy has in communities that already have the workforce there, through maybe their oil engineer, who are a community with oil engineers because of that experience and expertise. It's the perfect place to cite a project. Whenever you know going in, you already have people who are engineers, who are technically trained in some of the things that are so transferable to the energy sector. I think it's kind of, even I thought there were going to be losers for states like West Virginia that were coal-trained states, but West Virginia now employs more people in solar installation than they do in coal. So it's a great example of how sort of the focused dollars through congressional actions have gone to exactly what they intended to go towards, is those communities.
Melissa, who are, the losers, who are the winners? What are the occupations that you see are, opportunities, and who should we pay more attention to?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, there will be winners and losers. However, I think what we're all saying here is that if this is done thoughtfully, we don't have to have losers. It's change. But you said in the beginning yourself, not everybody wants to change. Not everybody wants to be reskilled. And so that's a different bucket, hearts and minds, so to speak. I mean, obviously, in the heavily reliant carbon-intensive practices, those are going to get phased out. And so the counters to that is that the renewable energy section, renewable energy generation, solar, wind, hydro, energy storage, electric vehicles, green construction, the obvious ones. But I think also you're going to have more focus on where are the other sources besides the obvious. So I think you're going to see a continued increase in the alternative protein space. I think you're going to see a lot of focus in sustainable agriculture. As we go to EV and other things, there's going to be even more mining of critical minerals. I think in conjunction with that, you're going to have a lot more jobs in environmental conservation. And in the innovation space, both for critical mining and for ocean mining, how do you get these minerals that are needed without degrading? So I think you're going to see incredible innovation in those spaces. I also think that where there will be I think you're going to have unique bedfellows, so to speak. Those that have, in the more traditional industries, have learnings and best practices to offer in the new technology spaces. Whether that is through AI or just human to human, I think you're going to see learnings and skillings being monetized. And so I see that as an area that will be a winner as well.
Yeah.
I think we've been talking a lot about skilling, reskilling, upskilling of on-the-job training, but I want to go back to a point about education. And this starts way earlier. This starts when the kids when you send your kid to kindergarten, to preschool, because you need to have, in order to have a flexible labor force, an adaptable labor force, you need to have the right set of skills, even from the schooling age. So if we can only focus on what's going on in the job market, and we really need to take a serious look at what's going on in the schooling level, in the education sector, in the K-12, and make sure that kids are actually learning the things they need to be learning, to be critical thinkers, to be flexible, to be resilient, the basics, reading comprehension, and all those things that are needed in order for you to be a flexible worker. When it's easier to switch jobs if we are like us, maybe we have the type of, you were saying, I could probably shift jobs in my career right now, but not everyone has had the educational opportunities that we have here. So I think that investing in K-12 is also critical, even though it's not specifically on climate change education.
So going back to developing countries and the workers in, let's say, energy, that will lose. What is the role for, in terms of the public sector? What do you see as the role of the private sector or, civil societies in this transition, and to make sure that, we are capturing the opportunities and really helping those that are left behind? So, yes, Elizabeth?
Lots has been said, but both on the public and the private side. And let me sort of link it to a couple of other points that were raised, which is something that it's hard to analyze or analyze in this very careful way, but it's the heterogeneity of the innovation capacity that's going to be needed. And if we look at the LDC context, as we know, very high levels of informality and limited, let's say, education systems. And so those climate solutions, a lot of them are going to be very local, they're going to be very low tech, they're going to serve the local community, and who's going to come up with those ideas? It's the youth that are living there, right, who see that maybe that opportunity, that market niche, but they do need some kind of support to transform that into a business, and that obviously can most effectively come through a more flexible education system that is making people aware of climate change, and that's a big one, even in Eastern Europe. I mean, there's a real sort of put our heads in the sand, we're not going to think about this, so starting that quite young. I actually have used this example in talking to clients. I was a child of two heavy smokers in the 70s, and the public information campaigns completely convinced us to never take up smoking. I mean, we hated our parents smoking as well, but that worked. And so we brought those messages home to our parents. And I do think that there's a role for that also in sort of getting communities, parents on board that can come through the education system. But I really think, that the innovative, supporting that, soft skills, communication, innovation, to then enable, and I keep going down like that, meaning I'm thinking about informal and the less skilled, less formally skilled segment of the population, which is the one that I see more of.
Mariana?
So there's clearly a role for the public sectors, particularly regarding with like active labor market policies and passive labor market policies, making sure that, you have intermediation services, that you have unemployment insurance, the right social protection policies in place, but also there's a key role for the private sector, because the private sector needs to sit down and say, okay, these are the skills we need. These are the type of incentives we need, like fiscal incentives we need in order to deploy this type. So the public sector can go it alone, the private sector can go it alone. And as it was mentioned also, we need civil society. We need to include everyone. Otherwise, we're going to have the difficulties like we had in past transitions, and I think we need to learn the lessons from the past. It's like, yes.
But I also see, like looking at the energy mix today, I think we have time. That's my humble opinion. I mean, a lot of these countries are still relying on fossil fuels. So, renewable energy is maybe 5% of the energy mix, and we're getting to net zero by 2050. I think we have time to do the plans and the retraining, but I don't know, maybe you have different opinions. Elizabeth?
You said we have time to get things in place?
Well,
I would say, I don't think we have time.
Because we don't, I mean, to be honest, like the energy transition, if we want to be optimistic, probably will take more time than 2050, right? That's my
yes,
humble opinion.
but we absolutely have to start today in a big way because, I think we can't afford to wait, and especially to your point of we can't waste a generation of young people who will be driving this. So we need to invest right now in the youth in Africa, because if we don't do that, we are going to miss out on the 20 years from now when they will hit the labor market. And actually, I was in a meeting yesterday with Indermit Gill, the chief economist of the World Bank, and Jeffrey Sachs, talking about the responsibility of governments, DFIs, we're here at the World Bank IMF spring meetings, the private sector to finance this transition. I keep coming back to the financing because this is a big, 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 big problem. And I've found so many times when I sit with climate people, and I talk to many of them, and when we raise the education and skills piece, they say, but that's not climate finance. That needs to be coming from education. And there's this bifurcation, and you say, but no, we need to finance this whole thing. We can't just say climate finance is just going to technology or to, it has to also be about capacity building. Now, when we look at the numbers that we've developed for how you actually finance low-income country education systems, the current estimates are that we will need between 8 to 12, in some cases 15% of GDP spending on education to be able to train and skill the current generation of young people. Now, most low-income countries, revenue tax to GDP ratio is between some cases 10%, 15%. So we have a huge problem because we could easily absorb the entire revenue of a country to invest in human capital. So actually, I'm sort of pointing at the World Bank again because the World Bank is just getting ready for its big IDA replenishment. And the big message there has to be, we need to help low-income countries finance their human capital transition, because if we don't, we're setting ourselves up for absolute failure 20 years, 10 years, 20 years from now to have the energy transition. And that will require low-cost, long-term borrowing and financing to these, in addition to private sector. That's also not explored enough. What are the solutions in terms of bringing the private sector in to help fund some of this? But what we do need is a huge and massive upscale in international finance to low-income countries to enable them to make that transition. And we are in a situation where countries are currently heavily indebted. That needs to be restructured. And then we need to get low-cost borrowing and financing facilities to those countries.
Andrew, I know you already spoke about this, but what do you see, the role of companies like yours and others, working with the public sector to really, make a successful transition?
Yeah, I think I'd just step back and think about the development process of a project. That's where I would start. And you're not crazy if you don't know what the development process looks like. I didn't know what it looked like until I started working for Invenergy. But we really, as an industry, a lot of times come into communities very, very early, 2-3 years before we even start working on a project, with land agents and community experts that come in and really just start building relationships across the community. We can't build a project if the community doesn't want it. We don't exercise eminent domain authority through states like maybe a utility would. We really have to build projects where they're wanted. Now, of course, there's a lot of challenges associated with that. But part of the process there is really negotiating with the local community on building a project in their community. So a lot of times what we see is the community say, we need to learn how to do what you do in order to be a good community partner for you. So invest in our local community college. Invest in our technical college for wind training, invest in our manufacturing education programs. And so we do that in many, many cases. It's an example of where the local government or the state government really can have a hand in sort of guiding some of those funds and resources to programs that would be helpful for the community. As just an example, I remember I've been at Invenergy now 6 years, minus a brief break where I worked for the administration, but we built a project in Dole County, South Dakota, and funded the wind technician program in the same community. We benefit, of course, because we get to build the project, but more importantly, we get to benefit because those people now can work at our facility and facilities of our industry partners. I also wanted to highlight one of the requirements in the IRA that I think was such a great idea is the apprenticeship requirement for taking some of those funds. Apprenticeship programs are really earn-as-you-learn programs. So workers who want to come into the transition can, through these opportunities that Invenergy and other developers are opening up, to actually get paid while you're training on the job. They're trained in all aspects of the project, construction and maintenance, rewiring, heavy machinery operations, and really a high standard workforce program. That's just one example. There are so many more that we have at Invenergy and that I think are available across the industry. But I think, to your point, this really is a partnership between the public and the private sector.
Mel, you've worked with both public and private, so what is your view?
Yeah, thank you. I think that government has an obligation, and we really heard this loudly at COP27 in Glasgow. The private sector was very loud in saying, government, we want parameters. We need your help in setting up these frameworks. And I think that governments do have that obligation to provide that framework so that business knows where it's going. I also think that governments have an obligation to provide social protection to those workers that are going to be affected by this transition. I think it's a shared responsibility between government and business, but I think governments have to have those protection plans in place. And I think business needs to do what it does well, innovate. They need to work with government and each other to figure out how to solve these problems. I mean, that is where business in the private sector is quite effective. But I love what Andrew said, and I'd really love to double down on the community engagement piece. Business has access to stakeholders, consumers, and communities in a way that government just doesn't. And we can't assume as the government we know what every community needs. And so this is where, again, I talked about that dialogue before. I think this is where the dialogue comes into place, is that we need that community engagement, we need that buy-in. And if you'll humor me for a minute, doubling down on what Mariana said, in the K through 12 space, I think it goes even one step further. And I'm speaking, I guess, as a parent here. Kids watch everything their parents do. And if the parents aren't doing it, the kids aren't doing it. Why aren't the parents doing it? Where is that? What might it take to move the adults in a household to the next step? And I look at the example of Monterey, California. They were trying very, very hard to get people to compost and recycle, and it wasn't working. Nobody was doing it. It was free. It wasn't doing it. They had engagement with the community, and it turned out in this community, sticks were better than carrots. And what they offered instead was, we will charge you. We're going to charge you for everything that you do landfill. All composting and recyclable is free. And the amount of landfill went drastically down. Because in this community, a stick was better than a carrot. We can't assume that it's a one-size-fits-all. And again, this is where I really think we need that dialogue and the building of trust, and starting with the kids. You have to educate, and it needs to start at the beginning, but we also need to educate those of us in the middle who've been doing it a certain way. And that's, again, where I see the community engagement to figure out what is it going to take in the different communities to push you to doing things differently.
Wonderful. We have 15 minutes left. I want to drill a little bit deeper into the skills component. We've talked about occupations, the role of public and private. Finally, I know we don't have a crystal ball, but and Mariana, you talked about just going back to, and Lisbeth also mentioned this about basic education. But what are some key skills that you think are going to be needed in the next 20 years in terms for the transition? And what are some it can be hard skills, technical skills, and obviously what are called the soft skills. And again, going back to the private sector, like we have the public sector providing education, but private sector providing training. Like, what do you see are those skills that are going to be needed in the future? So maybe I'll start again, from Elizabeth down.
I mean, one of the challenges is the government has a hard time knowing what the skills are and needs to hear it from the private sector. The other point I'd like to make is that We need very high-level skills. We need STEM, for sure, for these high-tech solutions. We're also going to need to crowd in low-tech solutions. I think you made the point. Every job needs to become greener. So every firm needs to become sustainable in some way, whatever that means. That might just mean buying more sustainable inputs. And you do not change your production technology, no impact on the current workforce or the skills. Others might need to buy a new piece of equipment that requires a skilled person on staff full-time knowing how to do that. Others might mean buying a piece of skilled high-tech equipment and you need a one-day on-the-job training, and boom, you've got a greener skill and your firm is more flexible. So I think one of the challenges of, we can look at the arriving workforce, the future workforce, but when we look at the current workforce, how do you get them to, and this is because the current workforce is currently employed in firms, how do you get firms to be adopting these greener production technologies or greener inputs, and then how do you facilitate the skills acquisition for part of that? And I think that has to be a role for, government incentives that pique the private sector's interest. So there needs to be a real marrying there.
Mariana, any thoughts?
So I think, like when we were thinking about green skills, you have first very technical skills. So basically the skills you need to do a particular job. So if you are, EMT or first respondent, and there's going to be an increase in EVs, then you need to respond to car accidents in a different way because these are electrified vehicles. So for example, you need trainings very specific for how to provide first response services to an EV and not a combustion vehicle. Same happens with drivers of EVs, and same happens with car mechanics. Those are very specific skills that for a very particular job. But then you also have this more core skills in which you need ingenuity, creativity, problem solving. You need to reading comprehension. You need to understand the causes of consequences of climate change, and those are more general and they're not tied to specific occupation, and those are basically the role of K-12 education for you to provide. And then you also need some of transformative skills or basically, if you're talking about, how we ensure that this transition is just, and so also you have, be aware of social injustices, be proactive in your community, capacity to, have a dialogue with people who think differently from you. So again, it's a whole set of skills. I can't point you to one or two, but basically, there are ones that are very specific for some types of jobs, but others that are way more general, goes through that, that can be used not only for the green transition, but as we were mentioning, digital transition, because they're happening at the same time. So.
Yeah, I think you've said it all. No, I think, there's a obviously there's a pyramid of basic to kind of going to be more technical and so on, but I think that the really important question is, how are our education systems going to be flexible enough to respond to these changing needs? I think that the bigger question for us lying ahead is that question, not so much about what specific skill do we need, even though that's important and we need to determine that at the local level through the partnerships that you've been describing with local communities and the business community and all that. But we have a real issue with the supply side, and currently our education systems are characterized by slow, bureaucratic, set in their ways. We are never going to be able to do what we're just describing here in terms of responding to all these skills. So I think that is the bigger challenge ahead for us, and starting to think about the possibilities of creating these more flexible programs that can address some of the skills needs, which will be constantly evolving. Is going to be important, looking at how AI can play a role in this, and really thinking, I keep going back also to the sort of developing world and the entrepreneurship skills that I think are really going to be important in this new economy.
Yeah, I think my response is going to sound a bit like cognitive dissonance, but I'll try to clarify. I think it depends, and all the skills. Your question is, what skills do we need? And it depends on who the employer is, but it also is all skills. Because of this new economy, like I mentioned at the very top, there are so many sort of ancillary benefits and ancillary industries and services and jobs and opportunities coming as a result of a full-scale transition. There are opportunities no matter what your background is or experience, from all the way from no background of any experience, not technical, all the way up to your engineers and your doctorates of statistics and everything in between. Just a few examples. I reached out to our team before I came over here to find out, just this week, tell me a little bit about what's going on in the company as it relates to workforce. And these are just a few examples that I thought was kind of a cool picture of how much the industry is working across the board with folks on opportunities. But tonight we're hosting the 4 Block Connect at our Chicago office. 4 Block is a not-for-profit organization that supports veterans who are transitioning from military service into clean energy. On Monday, Invenergy will host the National Black MBA Association Chicago chapter, or headquarters in Chicago, for their annual State of the Organization, talk about how these businesses can take advantage of the energy transition. On Thursday, we're joining a career fair in Chicago with support from the National Society of Black Engineers, Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, and Society of Women Engineers. The company has also started a company called Reactivate a couple of years ago, specifically focused on low to moderate income communities and training the workforce, and that was only as a direct result of incentives provided through the IRA that we were able to create Reactivate. So those are just a few examples. And then, of course, it always is good to just remember that most of these jobs are so technical in nature that we can train them on the job based on the technology they support. For example, we're hiring wind technicians, which are the people who fly up 500 feet in the air on these really scary wind turbines and do maintenance work. That's a job that really doesn't require any specific expertise. We can train those people on the spot based on the equipment we have.
Great.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. I think there's just 2 things that I'd like to add that I see as kind of underpinning everything, which are, I guess you'd put them in the soft skill spot, which is, I think you need to start with level setting. Don't assume your workforce knows why they're being asked to transition. Don't assume they've been following, UNFCCC discussions and they're bought in. It's amazing how far your workforce will go when they're bought in and they understand. So I think we need to step back a little bit not to assume that those who are asking to change jobs know why we're asking them. So I think we need to start there. And I think the other piece is I don't know, maybe sillier when you talk about it, but we might be asking people who've always worked in a team to now do something to transition to a skill that's far more independent. They need to learn problem solving. They've been doing a team approach. And it also might be the obvious. You're asking someone who's been far more independent to suddenly transition to a team. Don't assume that people can just then jump. You need these softer pieces, or you're going to be setting your employees up for failure even if they understand the hard skills. So let's not forget, I guess, that we're dealing with people who have different backgrounds and values and missions, and we need to bring everyone along.
Wonderful. We have just a few minutes left before, I know I'm standing in your way from lunch, so we have some minutes left for questions from the audience. So if you can just state your name and your affiliation, and I believe there are microphones. Ilya, can you facilitate? Thank you so much. We have a gentleman here on the right and a gentleman here on the left.
Thank you. My name is Andres Marquez Lara. I'm the founder and CEO of YouFacilitate. We're a global facilitation company. So I love hearing about the human part because that's so key, right? But one thing I was hearing this last part was like, it's all about identity. I mean, the transitioning is not just about like, oh, new skills, I'm a machine, I'm gonna do it now. It's like you're asking people, a coal miner, to now become a green job person. And then that's not just a knowledge thing. So I'm curious, how do you think about that element, the identity? How do you help people transition at scale to a new identity?
Thank you. And let's take 2 and then
Hi, my name is Rahul Shah. I'm a social impact consultant based in Bombay. We're living in a world today with a lot of these emerging economies, developing nations that have very young population. And there's also a lot of economies that are you know, have a very aging population. Could you talk a little bit about how both types of economies can leverage this demographic dividend towards, you know, the energy transition? And, you know, like can say you create livelihoods in India for the transition in, say, Japan or things like that, just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Well, two very good questions. One on, you know, identity with your job, and then the second one on the demographics. So who wants?
On the identity one.
Okay.
Something that it's interesting when you come at it. I love being a labor economist because you've got the economics, but people have jobs. So you can always sort of ground truth with, oh, what would I do in that situation? Or how would I value that? And you realize that we're complex, right? And so it's not just a question of finding, for a displaced coal miner, finding another job. First of all, it might be hard to even find a job with a similar wage. So you have that whole block. And if you're older, you might say, oh, forget it, I'm done, I'm leaving the labor market. At the same time, if we put too much emphasis on the culture aspect, I mean, the reality is that the world has transformed. It takes a long time to transform, but you know, we're not all farmers anymore, right? So we all learned how to sort of take on other activities. I do think communication is a really important part in some of our work in Eastern Europe. You know, there's a real reticence because a lot of these economies are very dependent on coal for all of their energy security. And to your point, Romina, in terms of it's going to take a long time to transition, we do need to start now, but it is going to take a long time. When the government isn't even clear that this job is going to go away, then somehow there's this hope, and you see it in West Virginia too. Hold on, it's okay. It doesn't mean me. It means everybody. And so I think there's this really important role for communication. I mean, in the countries I'm working in, government's not communicating, but there's probably private sector communicating that needs to go on as well. And that can get at that sort of culture aspect softly without going, come on, you guys, you're done. Coal doesn't exist anymore. But it's a complex challenge.
Can I pick up on that answer and add a little to it as well? I totally agree with everything you said. You know, relocating because of jobs is really hard, but perhaps the emotional relocation, if you will, is even harder for some folks. And I think you're exactly right. It just is going to take some time. But one example that we have and that we've seen as a company over the last 20 years is Texas. Texas has transitioned its energy production, electricity production, in a huge way. Invenergy alone owns 16 wind projects in Texas. That's it's certainly our biggest state in terms of assets developed and built. But we see folks all the time in Texas go from being an oil engineer to being a wind technician. And the reason for that is Texas really, to be honest with you, invested pretty early in the wind. And folks see it and they're like, oh, it's just another part of our energy experience. I think you'll start to see that more and more, and maybe that emotional kind of leap will be a little less hard as we kind of progress, but I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. If I could quickly comment on both. The first is I would love to say that you would do this on an individual basis and it might have to be at a town hall, but don't assume that you know why that person identifies with their job. It might be they want a brotherhood. And you're like, okay, you're going to still get that in the other one. It might be that they love the fact that they're the third generation. And maybe you have to work with them to see that they could be the first of the next. Maybe it's the salary. Maybe it's the hours. But we tend to project what we think would upset us if we were in their situation, when oftentimes we're wrong. So we're quick to react, and I think that we just need to slow, as fast as we need to go in this transition, since we are dealing with human beings, I think we need to slow down long enough to ask the questions, and we will be shocked to find out how many of these issues we can meet just by asking the questions. And as for your more complicated question, not to give a dismissive answer, but we're in a global world. And when I was working for a multinational company, we would do incubators and put out, we have an issue, who can solve it? And you would get because of the global nature of the world, around the world, doesn't matter on age, right? People coming in to say, I have a skill, I have a thought, I have an idea. And I think we need to encourage more of looking outside of our own space to find who has those thoughts, ideas, and solutions. And I think just by doing that, you're going to get more of both sides of the age bracket.
Lisbeth, do you
I
want
think the demographics question is the million-dollar question, and I think it's a really good question that we haven't tackled enough. And I think it gets complicated by the sort of anti-migration sentiment. There's actually, I don't know whether you've seen the book Streets of Gold around the migration into the United States. Wonderful book showing how good this has been for the US economy. And I think there is lots of evidence that there is a real grand bargain that could be made between the nations who have declining, aging populations and nations who have young, very vibrant populations with sort of abundance of labor. Germany actually has done something quite clever with some of the African nations where they need engineers for their e-car industry. Africa needs engineers for its own economies. There's a bargain between Germany and Africa, in this case Jordan, to train engineers in Jordan. Some of those engineers can be supporting the Jordanian economy. Some of those engineers go to Germany. And that kind of what's called circular migration, also bringing people over and then also benefiting their own countries, that I think is, I have not seen a kind of real debate on this because we're all getting stuck into this sort of very political issue around migration. But I think it's a really good question.
I don't have anything further
Okay,
to add.
I think we're out of time, and I thank you all for attending, and please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.